As we approach the 1 year anniversary of the tragic death, the murder of George Floyd, Sir Trevor McDonald and Charlene White host a new hour-long documentary for ITV exploring its impact for people living in the UK. It's an important film. It's a brilliant film. And the co-host of it is Charlene White. She joins us now. Hi, Charlene.
Hi, Mark. Lovely to see you.
Great to have you on the show. Why did you and Sir Trevor decide to make this programme?
Well, this is a subject that we're both hugely passionate about, both the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement that followed. And it just seemed like an obvious subject and an obvious question for us both to pose and try and find the answer to.
And what do you think has been the impact on the UK? We know that America has, essentially now entered a period of considerable self-reflection about the issue of race and racism in the States. What about here in Britain?
Well, we've had a lot of conversations, and I think that was definitely evident over the past 12 months. I mean, the issues regarding education, for example, and perhaps looking at things like history from a slightly different perspective. These are things that have been spoken about for a very, very long time. But over the past 12 months, these things have come to the fore, including institutional racism, and also the fact that actually perhaps we're moving away from the overt racism that, say, my parents would have experienced, and more into the sort of racism which you can't always pinpoint, but doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. But then I know I sort of say the overt racism doesn't happen quite as much, but it does on social media,
yeah.
and footballers have spoken very openly and honestly about the impact that it's had on them, for example.
Yes, and unfortunately, very nasty people online are trolling and often of a racist nature with impunity. They don't think or fear they'll get caught, Charlene.
Yeah, I always put it down to manners, really. And what people yell on social media, they're very unlikely to do that to somebody's face when they see them on the street. But we have seemed to have come to a period in time where people sort of feel that that behavior online is acceptable. And they really need to remember that what they do offline and on the streets should also feed through to what it is that they do online, because they just wouldn't. I mean, a lot of the abuse that Black women, for example, put up with online, it doesn't quite happen in the same overt nature on the streets in their everyday lives. It happens in a quieter way, and some would argue a more calculated way.
And you've worked on this film with Sir Trevor McDonald. He's lived a few more decades than you, Charlene. You're a spring chicken by comparison, but he must have seen race relations in this country change significantly.
Yeah, one point that he does make in this film is that he didn't think that in his lifetime that he would see a movement such as this spread so fast and so wide in the way that it has. And obviously, as you say, he's a journalist who's been working here for decades. He's seen so much, both here and internationally. And to be able to get his perspective on this was really important. And the generational gap between us was equally important, because, the things that I see online, for example, Trevor isn't online as much as I am. So there are things that he wouldn't necessarily see. The Bianca Williams video from last summer, where she was stopped and searched by police when she was with her partner, Ricardo, and their 3-month-old son. There's a scene within this film where we show Trevor that for the very first time, because I think we underestimate how generationally people see things in slightly different ways. It doesn't make it any less shocking. But when they do see it for the first time, it's like, wow, it just feels just insane in a way, really.
Some will wonder why an occurrence and the most awful tragedy and the most awful crime, of course, a murder in the United States, why that should provoke a conversation here in the UK. What would you say to that, Charlene?
But it's about the footage, isn't it? And I think historically, when situations such as this have been talked about, we haven't been able to see the incident in its entirety. And unfortunately, we have a situation where historically people have been able to say, yes, but something must have happened before he died. He must have done something. He must have provoked the police in some way. He must have done something awful in order for this situation to happen. I think this is possibly one of the first instances in which we have seen the build up to it, and the point at which those 8 and a bit minutes when we saw his life ebbing away, and when his life was brutally taken. And I think that had a lot to do with the impact it had globally, because all of a sudden those who would make excuses had no excuses to use. And they had to wake up to the fact that these things can happen, and that people have been talking about these things happen for a very long time. And suddenly we're able to see it.
But in America, why would we conflate the most awful crime in America to the UK?
Well, the incident itself isn't perhaps something that we have experienced here, but the reasons why and the reasons behind that are instances and situations which I think Black people around the world could relate to.
Yeah.
And it isn't as though it happened there and then only we were impacted here in the UK. It was a global situation. And I think that conversation and understanding that there is a unifying experience of Black people around the world, which we really have to understand and really take in and listen to. And I think it's easier often to ignore what people are saying, but perhaps the even easier option is to listen and understand.
Definitely, and to have a conversation and to reflect on these issues, Charlene. I think that's absolutely right. One other thought, and you'll have heard this argument, that the words Black Lives Matter are the three most important words in the language. I mean, it is a sentiment that, only some truly monstrous people would argue with that. What about the organisation, the political group that are part of that, the group that have maybe appropriated that message, who seek the defunding of the police, the dismantling of capitalism and the emptying of prisons?
Well, that's an American sentiment. And I think that defunding the police isn't something that we even understand here, because the way in which police there are funded are very different to the way that police are funded here. And I think conflating that and making it an issue here is quite a dangerous path to go down, because they're two completely different things. When we talk about Black Lives Matter here, we talk about the way in which lives are impacted here. We talk about the institutional racism, and people always say, yes, but what about this? And what about that? Other people are suffering too. By saying Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that we're ignoring the struggles of other people within the UK at all. It's maybe looking at the fact that, yes, those struggles do exist, but the figures show that the impact tends to affect Black Britons more. For instance, there's a higher percentage of Black Britons that live in poverty compared to other groups.
Yeah. And for example, if you apply for a job with a Nigerian name, you're, I believe, 8 times less likely to get a call back.
Yeah, exactly. And these, again, are figures that are not new, but there are figures that perhaps people have found it easier to ignore and go on with their daily lives, pretending as though those things don't exist. But the reality of being an ethnic minority within this country is there are certain circumstances that we can't ignore. There are certain daily things that happen within our lives, like, for instance, that Black women are 5 times more likely to die during childbirth. Again, these are not new figures, but they are ones that have been highlighted within the last 12 months, and they're situations which people are finally talking about.
Indeed. Well, look, the film is tonight. It's at 9:00. What response are you hoping will be achieved from the film? Because I think it's amazing. But tell me what you're hoping it can actually, produce by way of a conversation.
Well, if we were living in normal life, Mark, I would say that I'd love people to go into their offices and chat about it around the water cooler, as we used to do back in the day.
Oh, I remember those days.
I know, I miss those days. But we are in a situation where that just can't happen. But if everyone could do it on the Zoom meetings tomorrow, that would equally be as good. But I think it's perhaps a time for people to reflect and look at life from a slightly different perspective, really. Yeah. And people talk to us with such honesty. And I think people might find some bits of it quite shocking, but also looking at the other side of it. We talked to Lord and Lady Harewood about Harewood House in Leeds and the way in which, they have dealt with the fact that their money comes from the slave trade, and they profited from the bodies and blood and torture of Black people back in the day. And it's incredible to hear Lord Harewood talk about that, and the fact that when they realised that, they immediately put in place their version of a reparations programme, by giving some of that money to local charities, which help to empower young people, which is a really interesting way of dealing with a history which was catastrophic.
Absolutely right. Charlene, it's been wonderful to have you on the show. Do come and see us in the studio. I think by June we'll be allowed to actually have a bit more contact, and you'd always be welcome here at Talk Radio. Charlene White is the co-host of the ITV documentary Has George Floyd Changed Britain? What are your thoughts? 03444 991 1000. Lots more to come.